Bien, pues bienvenidos a todos. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, please allow me just to make a small introduction in Spanish and we will switch to English shortly. Bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en este importante webinar de COMEXI, organizado por la Unidad de Estudios sobre Paz y Seguridad, Asuntos y Derecho Humanitario, en coordinación con la Unidad de Estudios sobre el conflicto de Ucrania y Rusia. Como saben, COMEXI se ha organizado con 31 grupos de estudio, cada uno promoviendo o analizando diferentes sectores, diferentes temas de relaciones internacionales, de asuntos internacionales, con el objetivo de tener un mejor conocimiento de estos temas tan importantes en la sociedad mexicana, tanto por la membresía como por gente interesada en estos temas. Les agradezco mucho que estén con nosotros. Quiero agradecer al doctor Sergio Alcocer, presidente de COMEXI, a Patricia Zúñiga, directora general de COMEXI, y a Diego Gómez Pickering, coordinador de la sección de las unidades donde estamos nosotros, a los miembros de la unidad que coordino y sobre todo a las dos grandes especialistas que tendremos el día de hoy presentando sobre este importante tema. Tenemos que parar a las 12 en punto por un tema de que una de nuestras panelistas está en Ucrania y se encuentra ahorita, hay momentos donde se va la luz, hay lo que llaman los rolling blackouts, entonces tenemos que parar en ese momento, esperamos que no se corte su participación antes y que todo funcione bien, pero bueno, tenemos la gran ventaja de contar con alguien en terreno que nos pueda platicar un poquito qué es lo que está pasando. Me gustaría presentar a Ana Vyshniakova. Ana es coordinadora del proyecto de documentación de propaganda genocida del Grupo de Asesoramiento Legal de Ucrania, en coordinación con el Grupo de Derechos Humanos de Crimea. Asimismo, coordina el proyecto para el establecimiento de cursos de entrenamiento para la recolección de evidencia de crímenes de guerra de fuentes abiertas y ocultas, organizado por Berkeley Witness y el Instituto Auschwitz. Ana recientemente trabajó en Camboya, indagando sobre las consecuencias del genocidio en las sociedades en una perspectiva de largo plazo. De igual manera, se ha desempeñado como investigadora en el Centro de Mantenimiento de la Paz Kofi Annan y como abogada voluntaria en el campo de refugiados Pudumbaram en Ghana y asesor especial del ministro de Relaciones Exteriores en temas de xenofobia y antisemitismo. También contamos con otra gran especialista, Mariana Salazar Albornoz, quien es licenciada en Derecho por la Universidad Iberoamericana y maestra en Derecho Internacional por el Instituto Universitario de Altos Estudios Internacionales en Ginebra. Actualmente es miembro del Comité Jurídico Interamericano de la Organización de los Estados Americanos, donde es relatora para la privacidad y protección de datos personales y para el derecho internacional aplicable al ciberespacio. Es también asociada para programas académicos del Instituto Auschwitz para la prevención del genocidio y atrocidades masivas y profesora de Derecho Internacional Público, Humanitario y Penal Internacional en la Universidad Iberoamericana. A partir del año 2023, se desempeñará como miembro del Consejo del Registro de Naciones Unidas sobre daños causados por la construcción del muro en territorios palestinos ocupados. La maestra Salazar tiene una larga carrera trabajando en la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, en el sector privado y en organismos internacionales, incluyendo como asesora como miembro del Consejo Asesor Global de Alto Nivel del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja para la Protección de Civiles de Amenazas Digitales durante conflictos armados. Muchísimas gracias a las dos por estar con nosotros. Como saben, este evento será en inglés, toda vez que buscamos que Ana hará su presentación en este idioma, y les pido, si tienen preguntas, las vayan subiendo en la parte de preguntas y respuestas de Zoom para que yo, posterior a la participación de las dos ponentes, pueda hacerles estas preguntas. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Voy a pasar a inglés y les agradecemos mucho su participación. So now we switch to English, and we want to again thank both of our amazing panelists for taking the time to be with us and to help us understand this such an important issue that we're dealing with and that the Ukrainian people are living with every day since February 24th, when Russia launched what it called a special military operation aiming for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, which of course was an invasion of Ukraine that has created around 8 million displaced persons, food insecurity for 18 million people inside Ukraine, and an international food crisis according to the World Food Program. Today, we would like to focus on the humanitarian aspects of this conflict and not necessarily on the geopolitical aspects of it. Very interesting, very important, but it's not the issue for today. We are fortunate to have with us two amazing experts, and one of you, Anna, who is on the ground, who can let us understand from Mexico and from every other place where we are signing up to this webinar, what is really happening? What are you going through? I was telling the public, those who are with us earlier, that there are rolling blackouts going on in Ukraine, and we hope that we're not affected by one. But if we are, we'll deal with it and we'll carry on just as you are with your everyday life. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I would like to ask Anna to take the floor and share with us your views, explain to us what's happening on the humanitarian basis, your everyday experience, but also something that's very important, very interesting, on the work that you're doing to document issues that would later we'll be able to use in terms of creating accountability for those committing crimes. And how does that work out? What are you doing? And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, interesting questions about it. Thank you again very much, Anna, for your time, and the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. So unfortunately, everything that I can say in Spanish, it's Buenos dias from Kiev. And thanks again for inviting me to this event. So basically, Roberto asked me to do something absolutely impossible to tell you about our last 10 months just in 20 minutes. So I was thinking like how to build my presentation, but I think that probably the most interesting format for you would be just like a frank chat, because I was told that the audience is quite prepared reading Economist or Washington Post. So probably for you, it would be interesting like to know basically the frank situation from the ground. And then you would be able like to pose me any questions, I mean, like more smart about numbers and etc. So probably I would just share with you my experience, and then we will talk a little bit about propaganda as far as I'm working with it on a daily basis. So I just remember very well when the conflict started, like on the 24th of February, when my father called me. I was at that time at UK, and he called me like it was 3 a.m. or something like that, that Kiev is bombed. I remember very well that before 24th, there were no Ukrainians who were believing that there would be that large-scale aggression. As far as you're all concerned, as far as you all know, that the conflict actually started in 2014. But from the social point of view, it was quite an interesting situation, because I'm basically from Kiev, from the center of Ukraine, from the capital. I cannot say that we were feeling the war that was going in the east of Ukraine. Basically, everything started from Maidan events, and Kiev was highly involved in that. But then the conflict became, for us, people like from central Ukraine or western Ukraine, it became more frozen. So we could not believe that the full-scale aggression in 21st century can start. And when my father called me like crying, Anna, Kiev is bombed, I was like, okay, what to do? And how to evacuate like my family, how to help to evacuate my friends. So at the first days, as far as I was abroad, I tried to organize the evacuation processes. So all the logistics, starting from taking people on from the ground, finding the drivers, the buses, and etc., to bring them to the border, to help them to cross the border and to find for them the apartments. So this was the project like for the full logistics. I had like 40 volunteers, and that was an amazing experience because people cooperated immediately. Like it took us just 2 days to create a website, and people were working like from the shelters with the absence probably like of internet, of light, and that was absolutely amazing. And then all the 10 months they went like, they just passed like one day, because for all the Ukrainian there was no spring, there was no summer, and now we cannot understand like where is the autumn. Now there is the new, let's say, phase of the conflict with bombing of infrastructure. I was told like from my friends from Syria back in August that they were telling me, Anna, go and buy generators. I was like, which generators? It's impossible that the infrastructure would be bombed next to the winter, because winters in Ukraine are incredibly cold. It's like -10, -20 degrees. And basically what is going on now? Now the infrastructure is massively bombed, and it's unbelievable that in 21st century we're sitting like with the light, we have light just 2 hours per day, 4 hours. So we're having constant blackouts. Luckily, we do not have any kind of other shortages, so we have water, but there were a couple of days when we didn't have neither light, no internet, no water, and that was in the capital of Ukraine. So that is quite unbelievable. The situation is quite different in different regions. I just came back from Kherson region. I think that probably all of you have heard about Kherson. It's on the southeast of Ukraine and it was occupied. So I went there to investigate some cultural crimes, and I understood like how different the situation is in Kiev and in Kherson. So for example, in Kiev, there are missile attacks, like let's say 1 time per week. So at 5 a.m. or at 6 a.m. we are woke up with, that emergency alarms, go into the shelters or continuing to sleep, as I'm basically doing because we're quite tired of that. And well, sometimes something is ruined. Like, unfortunately, I'm still a little bit shocked. Yesterday, part of my house was ruined. So like we had a private house and now we have half of the private house, let's say like that. It's a very interesting feeling because it gives the feeling of insecurity, because you understand that the missile attack, the chances that it will strike you or strike your house are quite small. But yesterday I understood that the chances, there are some chances, let's say like that. But it's just 1 time per week. And when I was living abroad, I was spending like 6 months in Paris. The situation seemed much worse from the media, because when there is like there are a couple of missiles in the city, it seems like all city is on fire. But basically, when you are in the city, it's not so scary. What is really scary, these are the blackouts. But when I went to Kherson, I was absolutely shocked, because the attacks, the missile attacks are constant. So basically, like there are 5 missile attacks like in 1 minute, and you are just standing on the ground and it's like bam, bam, bam. But there is also quite an interesting impact on the people. I was absolutely like fascinated by the people who were living in the occupation. First of all, I was shocked about the quantity of people who were in the resistance movement. They were risking their lives. They were trying to rescue children, because one of the patterns of Russia is to kidnap orphans and to take them, to move them and deport them to Russian Federation, and then to find them Russian parents. Secondly, I was absolutely shocked by the directors of museums, because, the director of museum, it's even not a profession, it's a type of personality. So, all those kind of old, frail women, they became absolute superheroes trying to hide the paintings. And we have some really, really like Caravaggio or Rembrandt in Ukraine. So they were trying to hide it like from the occupants, risking their life, lying that the collections have already been evacuated. Then I was also shocked about how difficult it was to pass the checkpoints, because like on the checkpoints, you could be easily stopped and you could be shot. And definitely the tortures. The tortures is the problem. So it's not so easy to investigate it, because how it goes when we're talking about the occupied territories of Ukraine, We have, for example, Kherson, that Russians didn't destroy, let's say, so much. Of course, it's already too much, but in comparison to the villages around or to some towns around Kherson, it's not too much destroyed because it's kind of a, let's say, model city, yes, where they were, let's say, behaving. But what they were doing next to Kherson, because I was passing the villages, the towns around, there are no villages at all. Everything is just on the ground. Everything is just ruined. And these are definitely mass atrocities, and it looks quite horrible. What's about Ukrainians and refugees? You know, it's very interesting because I was working with refugees and I was working like with armed conflicts far way before 24th of February. But when you are becoming the person like that, the perception is absolutely different. And I was thinking, wow, Anna, you were working with people from Afghanistan and Syria, knowing nothing, literally nothing about how to work with refugees. So the situation is quite interesting about the psychology of the refugees. At the very start, there was massive evacuation, like approximately 5 million of people were evacuated, like were fled from Ukraine, and the majority of them came back. Even my grandmother, who is 81 years old, I evacuated her to Paris. And then after 1 month, I had to catch her because she was trying to go on the bus and to go back to Kiev. And she was crying and saying to me, Anna, I do not want to be abroad. I want to come back to cook for our guys. And the vast majority of Ukrainians are like that. So the majority of my friends, and including me, basically, we came back to Ukraine because you have the feeling of guilt, you have the feeling of home, and this is very, very strong. So, and the fun probably situation in this case is the ridiculous situation that so many Ukrainians wanted to go to Europe because basically everything started from the idea of integration of Ukraine to Europe. And then the majority of Ukrainians just understood how much we love our country and how much we want to come back. So this is like in brief about the situation. And beside that, definitely, this is quite a weird feeling to sit in Ukraine and not knowing like what would be in 2-3 days, because Ukrainians are incredibly adoptive. I was shocked because I came back to Ukraine only in October, that everything works. Business is working. Okay, business is surviving, let's say, but they survive. And also one, let's say, funny story, when I was in Kherson also, I was like with some people from, let's say, international organizations, and there was kind of mass shelling, and we went to the shelter, and then we saw in the shelter a couple of Ukrainian women, and my international colleague was like, why do these women look better than me? They all had the nails, they all had the hair made, and etc. So this is absolutely shocking, but Ukrainians continue to live like everything is fine. So no electricity, let's go for generators. No light, let's buy some lamps on the batteries. No water, okay, we will go and buy water. So everything like is adaptive. And now we are listening like and thinking about bombing, like about, I don't know, weather forecast. So I even caught myself on a thought, okay, Russians normally bomb at 2 p.m. So I should go to the shop probably at 1 p.m. To buy some stuff and then to be back home like by 2. So I think that a person is something who can adopt to everything. So basically now Ukrainians are adopting to the situation. The most horrible situation would be if the infrastructure strikes would be continuing, because in that case, we will not have electricity and we will not have central heating. So the plan is, let's call it the plan, that Ukrainians, like, I mean, many people have some kind of houses in the villages. So now people from the cities are moving to the villages where they, you know, can have the heating from the fire, not from the central heating. Because our mayor, for example, the mayor of Kiev and the mayors of big cities, they say that there can be a possibility that there would be a total blackout in the cities. So, and we are like sitting and waiting and probably sometimes making black jokes about that because we do not know what to do. Because for now, it's fine. We have light, as you can see, we have the internet, but no one knows what would be if the attacks would be constantly continuing, because to make the reappearance of the electricity station, it takes a lot of time because there are lots of details and they had to be ordered from many different countries. And I was seeing the photos of that electricity stations after bombardment, so there is just nothing there. So basically, this is about what we are living through, and I would be happy to answer your questions. And I still have some kind of 10 minutes, so yes, right?
Yes, go ahead, Anna.
So now I will go ahead with my professional topic with the propaganda. Just a couple of words about what goes in Ukraine now. Now we are thinking about the creation of special mechanism for having accountable the perpetrators, and we are having like huge arguments how to do that, because first of all, Ukraine didn't ratify Rome Statute, and our legislation is not properly adopted to international standards, and the quantity and the patterns of crimes are incredibly difficult, and there are so many of them. So we need to figure out which model of, let's say, special mechanism or special tribunal we need to invent. There are dialogues about that special tribunal for Putin, special tribunal for aggression, but definitely there are so many doubts about that, because, okay, we'll have the special tribunal for aggression, but where all the other crimes will go? Because our national system is 100% incapable to cope with all those crimes. So when the conflict started, we had different actors who immediately rushed to document the war crimes. And basically, we didn't know how to do that. I mean, we didn't have that kind of experience. So the prosecutor's office, they started to work like on their own branch, and I'm working in an NGO sector. So somehow, and this is a unique situation, who is working in NGOs, you can understand me, we managed to cooperate. So we managed to unite like many NGOs, and we called it Ukraine 5 AM Coalition, and we started the documentation processes. Definitely, when we're talking about war, the first type of the crimes that everyone is paying attention is shelling, because they look horrible, and killing of civilians. Let's say the second type of the crime is sexual and gender-based violence, because it's funded quite well, to be sincere. And basically, the majority of my colleagues started to document that type of crimes. So initially, I was also doing that, going like through all the horrible photos of Bucha and etc., and then learning how to do the verification processes and etc. And that turned to be not an easy process, because to document war crimes, it definitely, like, you definitely need a lot of knowledge. And if initially we just were making screenshots or taking random photos, so to build the system and to know how to archive it, how to save it, to save all the metadata, this takes time, and it was not an easy process. And then when I was living in Paris, now I will share the presentation and will tell you why I decided to work with propaganda. Just tell me if you can see the screen. Yep, great.
Yes, we can.
Great. So basically, let's start about the role of propaganda. So Russia has inherited like a horrific, massive system of Soviet propaganda that is like quite developed. So like adding some new features and what they are doing. So first of all, their propaganda helps to justify the commission of crimes before civilians. Secondly, to enhance mobilization. And third, to play the international card. And now I'm coming to my personal stories about enhancing, for example, mobilization. The majority of Ukrainians, who are living in central Ukraine or in eastern Ukraine, have the relatives in Russia. So my family we also have the relative there, the relative that were coming to Ukraine frequently and with whom we have very good connections. And my granny, who managed to come back to Ukraine, was talking with basically her cousin, and her cousin told that her son is going to be mobilized. So my granny, who has figured out all the corruption schemes, how not to be mobilized, started to tell her how to do for her son not to be mobilized. So basically my granny's nephew, and she was telling, but this is his obligation. My granny was like, what do you mean? And her cousin told, there are Nazis in Ukraine. She was like, what you are talking about? Which Nazis? You were coming to Ukraine. Which Nazis? And her cousin was constantly telling her that her son will go and denazify Ukraine. So basically waging the war against the relatives, against my grandmother. And this situation is quite... let's say it's quite frequent. So lots of families have just splitted because the level of propaganda is massive, and people in Russia, they are more believing what is going on TV than their relatives who are sitting in Ukraine. So they start to convince Ukrainians that we do not understand the situation, that there are Nazis. Now about play the international card. So when I was in Paris, I remember very well talking with all the taxi drivers and coming to some, let's say, official events and etc. Some narratives. Two of these narratives were, first was Ukrainians and Russians are brothers with common history. Why should you fight each other? And second, NATO has been poking Russian bear. Putin had no other way but to attack. So now on these two examples, and there are many examples of propaganda, but my time is limited. So I would just like to show you how this propaganda works. So Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. Brothers, what is brother? What is the concept of brother nation? Brother nations. So basically the concept that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are brothers, it appeared back to 18th or 19th century. And basically, I was reading that it appeared in Ukraine when Ukrainians needed some help of Russians to protect them from Rzecz Pospolita, so basically modern Poland. And then this concept was taken by Soviet propaganda, telling that, okay, we are all brothers, we are all happy, despite that people were not happy in Soviet Union at all, and we need to be united. Ukraine was oppressed by Russian Empire, then by Russia and Soviet Union, for many, many years. And the concept that we are brothers, it's quite weird. And let's say that the Russian concept is that there is Great Russia and Small Russia. So Great Russia is modern Russia, Small Russia or Malo Russia, they call it Ukraine. So Ukrainians are small brothers who always need help. They are not so smart as their elder brothers. So we need to help them and to protect them from angry Americans, because Ukrainians do not understand what they are doing. Then what really pisses me off very much when I'm told that we are fighting each other. Each other, really? I mean, Ukraine was not fighting and was not attacking Russia. So basically Russia attacked Ukraine. But this narrative, unfortunately, is quite frequent. So basically, instead of saying that Ukraine is a victim country and Russia is aggressor, we are hearing that we are brothers and we are fighting each other. And this is also, I love it so much that NATO has been poking Russian bear. So I know that there are lawyers here, and I'm sure that you know about the crime of aggression and use of force, and that the preventive self-defense in this manner, it cannot work. So basically NATO had to be on the very border of Russia, to start this conflict. And recently, if I can tell you the joke in this serious topic, but I can because this joke told our President Zelensky recently on Netflix. Maybe some of you saw his interview, but I will quote it. So two Ukrainians are meeting each other. Basically, in the original, it was two Jewish people from Odessa, because there are lots of Jewish people who are living in Ukraine, and they are asking each other, so what is the situation? What do they say? Well, what do they say? That there is war. Which war? Russia is fighting with NATO. Seriously? Yes, war, Russia against NATO. And what are the results? The Russians lost 70,000 troops. All rockets were used up. A lot of military equipment was destroyed. And how about NATO? Well, what about NATO? NATO has not arrived yet. So, I mean, this is quite a propagandist also narrative. And unfortunately, so many people believe it. And, you know, like playing those geopolitical games, saying that you do not understand the conspiracy theories and etc. But basically, the justification the NATO was poking Russian bear, it's absolutely, let's say, ridiculous justification of the crime of aggression that has had the place on the 24th of February. So still, I think I will have 5 minutes, right? Or already?
Yes, go ahead, 5 minutes.
Okay.
We're at the point, but I don't want to cut you off. Please go ahead.
Okay, just 5 minutes about this concept of denazification. So basically, the start of the denazification was the very start of that propaganda narrative was during Maidan. So when there was Maidan at the end of 2013 and 2014, and I was there, I mean, like I was studying at my second year at the university, and I remember very well Maidan. It was such, I mean, like it was basically the birth of Ukrainian nation, because at that time we had quite a pro-Russian corrupted president, and there was a big resistance movement against him because he didn't want to let Ukraine to join Europe. And Maidan started when the students were beaten by the forces of that president. So initially there were just 100 students, and when they were beaten the next day there were 100,000 of people. So after Maidan, LPR and DPR appeared, those Lugansk and Donetsk public republics. And at that territory, there already was that you need to be independent because there are Nazis in Ukraine. So basically people who were fighting Yanukovych, our ex-president, they were called Nazis. And then the narrative started to continue and continue. So Maidan was depicted not like fighting of Ukrainians for freedom, but like a barbarous upheaval that kicked out of the country a legitimate president. And these Nazis, how they are called in Russia, these are people basically who started the Maidan. So these are key people. And then the Nazism went from Maidan. So this is like this concept of modern denazification that basically, let's say in political legal terms, or in Raphael Lemkin's term, it's denationalization. So what Russians are trying to do, they are calling Nazis all Ukrainians who are speaking Ukrainian language, who want Ukrainian culture on the territories, who want to go to Ukrainian schools, who sing Ukrainian songs, they are already Nazis. And basically on the occupied territories, people were killed just because they wanted to speak Ukrainian language. So Nazis, I mean, like this concept from Second World War is just, you know, taken and put on the heads of Ukrainians who consider themselves Ukrainians. And just a couple of words about religious propaganda that it takes quite a massive place now, and this is a problem because we still have Russian church on the territory of Ukraine. So now our security services are going through these churches, and these are very recent events, and they are finding lots of manuals on how, you know, like to open the doors for Russians when they will come to Kiev, lots of propaganda, again, propaganda manuals and etc. And what is frequent, like a frequent thing that I'm facing when I'm documenting the propaganda, that Russia, I mean, like Russia is quite a religious country, to be sincere. And they misuse the religion a lot, telling that waging the war against Ukraine, it's kind of sacred war and they are fighting with the devil and etc. And Russia is kind of the saver of some values that Ukraine has lost because we want to join Europe. So this is in brief. Probably this is just, you know, the introduction for the questions, because it's impossible to tell everything in 20 minutes. And I would be more than happy to answer any of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for your presentation. I'll give the floor to Mariana. And please, if anybody has questions that you want to pose to either Anna or Mariana, go ahead and write them up in the question section, so we'll have them ready to present. Please, we don't have the capability to give the floor to anyone, but if you can just post your question, and we'll present it to the speakers. Mariana, screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you, COMEXI, for the invitation. And thank you so much, Anna, for accepting to be here. I think I will pick up on the last lines that Anna mentioned, because I've been working with Anna on the professional front. And why is it so important, all this work that she's doing on propaganda and on religious discrimination and on denazification purposes? And this is because it's a crime in itself to incite to genocide. And it's well known, all of the attendees here who are familiar with this upsurging of the Holocaust and the Second World War, derived from the Holocaust. There have been many studies of the steps that can be taken or that are usually seen when a genocide ends up occurring. And dehumanization and polarization and discrimination are some of the steps that are very important and that are crimes in themselves. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide is a crime in itself. And that is what Anna and her organization is working on documenting. So it's a very, very honorable work she's doing. And this takes me to speak a little bit in general from an overview legal perspective of the pathways to justice. So the humanitarian toll, I think that Anna has already mentioned what a personal experience it is to be there and to be in this conflict area. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, went to Ukraine last week. And he recently issued a statement, and he estimates that there are more than 18 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine right now. That 7.8 million people have fled the country already. 6.5 million are internally displaced. And there is an estimate, but it is a low estimate, and they clarify that this might be a number that might be much higher. There's an estimate of approximately 6,755 people killed and 10,607 people injured. Of these, 424 children have been killed and 781 children have been injured. So the humanitarian toll is immense, and we are living in a crisis. We are living in a crisis in a political juncture where Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. So many of the international responses are blocked. We've seen creative ways forward, creative ways of using the Uniting for Peace resolution in the General Assembly to avoid the blockage of the veto in the Security Council. We've seen also that there are many reports, just like as the OSCE report on the finding of crimes, and also the UN Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine created by the Human Rights Council, that have documented the very likely probability, almost for sure, of the existence of violations to international humanitarian law, the law that applies in armed conflict. Anna spoke to us about the attacks on electrical and critical infrastructure, electrical, gas, all hospitals, all these are prohibited directly by international humanitarian law. These entail responsibility by the state of Russia, but also individual criminal responsibility of the people who commit these crimes. These are war crimes. But also these reports that I've mentioned have documented probable crimes against humanity. And as Anna is working on, there are also claims of incitement to genocide, if not genocide in itself. So there are many violations to international law that are occurring right now. And the pathways for justice are limited. Anna mentioned that the national tribunals in Ukraine are working towards prosecuting and investigating some cases. They've spoken about more than 10,700 crimes, and then another 500 additional related crimes. But many of these are being judged in absentia, because the soldiers are not detained. And there's only a few, Anna may tell us, I've heard about 4 soldiers that have already been prosecuted, and maybe 41 cases in process in Ukraine. It's important to mention that Ukrainian law, the Criminal Code of Ukraine, does contain the genocide crime, and it does contain contain war crimes, but it does not contain crimes against humanity. It does contain incitement to genocide as well. So there are important limitations, also capacity-wise. At the international level, the criminal responsibility of Russian soldiers only for the crimes that are not the crime of aggression, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, are being investigated in the International Criminal Court. It was very interesting to listen to Anna on the doubts they have on the success of these processes. We do have to understand that the International Criminal Court has a prioritization strategy. So if it carries out successful prosecutions, it will go against the most highly responsible, but not against all the people responsible. So I think that's why Anna's mention of these proposals of creating a special tribunal or of a separate ad hoc tribunal, not only for the crime of aggression, but also for all the other crimes, this is a very interesting pathway. Another pathway we're seeing is universal jurisdiction. More than 17 states, particularly European states, are trying to exercise universal jurisdiction. We still have, of course, the issue of the person who is accused, who has to be detained and transferred to those jurisdictions. So this is a challenge. And finally, I would say, besides from all these pathways for individual criminal justice, we do have this process for state responsibility going on in the International Court of Justice, also with very limited concrete effects, political effects maybe, but concrete effects on the ground. Well, we do know that Russia is not paying attention to the order on provisional measures that was dictated since last March by the International Court of Justice. So what are we seeing? We are seeing a situation where unilateral measures by states, sanctions, economic sanctions, and other types of sanctions are maybe having a little bit more of a political pressure effect, and also the role of companies and of businesses, and how many businesses have actually left Russia in a sign of pressure and in a sign of international cooperation in order to generate a type of strangling effect on the conflict. Finally, I do want to mention that all the attacks by Russia against Ukraine, they can also be seen in the cyber domain. So we are seeing an approximate of 48 state agencies and also private companies that have been attacked, according to Microsoft, who is aiding Ukraine in the analysis of cyber threats. We do have to bear in mind that Russia is a very big cyber force. So the most recent statement by Microsoft is that we may expect more cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in winter in the near future. So we have to be aware of this. So with this general view, I would leave it at that and open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And I think you help us understand the international sphere, how we're looking at this. And yeah, we do have a few questions. I would like to go directly to pose them, and then I'll have a question for each of you. But first of all, Reina Musali, who's the coordinator of the study unit on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as Russia and Ukraine are not members of the International Criminal Court, so how can Putin could become accountable for aggression? Do we need to create a special trial to prosecute the Russian president? In that case, which are the actions that Zelensky is taking to achieve global justice? Mariana, you touched a little bit on this. Maybe you want to start and then we'll go to Anna.
Sure. So yes, indeed, Ukraine is not a state party to the Rome Statute, and Russia is not either. When the 2014 invasion occurred, Ukraine accepted in an ad hoc manner the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. A state can do that without being a party to the Rome Statute. So it accepted it from 2013 to 2014, and then it extended it from 2014 onward. So it is thanks to that acceptance of jurisdiction that the International Criminal Court is able to investigate and prosecute the crimes that are being committed on Ukrainian territory, because there is a link with the territory of a state that has accepted its jurisdiction. However, there is no way for the International Criminal Court to investigate the crime of aggression, because that particular crime does require, when it entered into force in 2018, a requirement was put into it that the aggressor state must have ratified the amendment that defined and inserted the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute. So Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute, and it has not ratified the amendment. So that is why the International Criminal Court would not be competent over the crime of aggression and only for the other three.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to touch on this?
Well, I can reflect a little bit on that special tribunal for aggression. Basically, we need here to distinguish between political narratives and, let's say, reality and real legal narratives. As far as I already told, the transitional justice process is a full architecture. So we need to consider everything. We need to consider domestic situation, not just political ambitions. I started to teach the prosecutors 2 years ago on international humanitarian law. They didn't know what it is. And still there are prosecutors who do not know what is international humanitarian law. One of the situations that I was facing that they were asking me additional protocol, what for do we need to use it? Because it's additional. So that was the level of knowledge of international humanitarian law just 2 years ago. Our prosecutors are amazing. They're doing incredible work. And I see the growth like in 2 years and basically like in the last 10 months. I adore them. They are making like huge job, but again, it's not enough. When we're talking about the war, we're talking about the rise of the crimes in hundreds times, let's say. And the obstacles with our legislation, as Mariana has already reflected about, and I mean, like, there are so many of them. It's not just about the absence of crimes against humanity, but definitely it's one of the biggest problems. Even about incitement to genocide, in our legislation, we do not need the incitement to be direct. We just need the incitement to genocide. We do not have specialists who are like super legal experts on this crime. So basically, when it comes to the capacity of the system, it's quite low. And when we're talking about that special tribunal, special court, or etc., it needs to enhance all the system, and it also needs like to help to prosecute all the types of the crimes. But here we are having ICC that is basically Khan told us that he is not very happy about this tribunal for aggression, and making the one crime type tribunal. This is quite a weird idea when we are having like all this picture of all the crimes. So now Ukraine on official level is definitely lobbying this tribunal for Putin. But again, how this tribunal would be established. So about Security Council, we cannot talk because there is Russia in Security Council. About General Assembly, having 2/3 of voices, in my personal opinion, for now, at the very moment, it's hardly possible. Making the Kosovo model when we will have the European agreement, that's perfect. But we know that Russians will flee probably to Latin America or to Africa. So it also needed like this model of the tribunal needs to be very well estimated, and it needs to be real, not just a beautiful word.
Thank you. And we are getting questions about that specific topic. Let's say, even if the tribunal goes forward, what it's the end game in the sense of could there be leaders that are judged and are sanctioned in some way, and that's a question that comes. And so as I'll pose you other questions, but maybe you can touch on that particular. And Carlos Francisco Torres just asked that part as well. Fernando Gonzalez Saife asks about the vulnerable groups, especially children, and asks if there are evaluations or mechanisms in place to deal with that specific issue. I would just, in terms of evaluations, I would just say that UNICEF does have a special report that comes about. I think they've had like 23 of them so far about the job they're doing regarding children. But Mariana and I don't know if you have any specific issue on children and vulnerable population. Anna, do you want?
Okay, so talking about the elderly, unfortunately, when we're talking about the elderly, this is always in all the conflicts, let's say, a forgotten group. So, of course, here we need to talk about different kinds of initiatives, let's say governmental initiatives, international initiatives, and the volunteer initiatives. The most efficient people now who are working like and helping the vulnerable groups of population, these are volunteers who are working on the ground and who are doing like really incredible job. For example, one of the initiatives that appeared at the very start of the conflict is remaking the buses and making them like buses/hospitals to evacuate elderly, because so many families, they were facing the very hard dilemma to leave their mothers, fathers, grannies, and grandfathers in Ukraine and to flee, or to stay with them, because there are so many disabled people in Ukraine who couldn't or didn't want to leave their cities and their towns. Talking about children, there are definitely much more different initiatives. For example, of course, UNICEF. And one of the biggest problems that we were facing is definitely human trafficking, because it's like the quantity of women and quantity of children that were leaving Ukraine, it's absolutely huge. And of course, some of them were taken on the border and disappeared. If we're talking about the deportation of children to Russia, this is very difficult to track them, because, for example, what was going on in Kherson and what is the pattern, how they are doing it. They come to school, so they do not take the children like that, of course. They take like that only the orphans. When we are talking about, let's say, not orphan children, they were coming to schools and they were putting, like the pieces of paper where they were offering to take children for rehabilitation. Yes, because there is war, the situation is difficult, so we will take children to Crimea for 21 days to take some buses. So then no one ever saw the children, but basically it was voluntarily. So parents had to say, yes, we want our children to go there. And of course, the majority of parents were saying no. But the ones who were saying yes, now they do not want to talk about that, because first of all, they do not want them to be called collaborants, because now that collaborant thing, it's a very big issue in Ukraine, because everyone is checked not to be collaborant, and we're having an article, we are having the punishment for being collaborant. So of course, when you're letting your children to go and take some buses on the Russian territory, there may be some issues. So people now are just scared to tell that their children were taken away. And we are trying to trace let's call them the deported children, but it's not an easy thing. When we're talking about the governmental institution, I will just tell you very sincerely, one of the cases when we had her, she was fired, the special envoy for children who was working in the president's office. And when she told that, so basically she told that in Kherson Oblast, children are hidden in the churches. And that was a secret information. So Russians immediately rushed to search the children in the churches, and they found the children who were hiding in the churches and deported them. So this is also, a little bit about the efficiency. Now we are all working on making the psychological help for children when we are talking about working with them in some cases. So basically to ensure that children have the decent level of psychological protection and that all the children's rights are observed as far as possible.
Thank you very much, Anna. And before we go to you, Mariana, to close this, because we are almost there. There's a question. I don't have the name of the person posing it, but it asks at the end of the day, what's the end issue for Russia? How does it win by doing this? And I think it's a core question. It's a very complicated one to answer, but it is a core question. And I would add one question on top of that, and then I'll ask Mariana to very, very briefly try to answer part of this, and then Anna give you one more minute. But we're living through, in the cycle of conflict, one of the most difficult periods of a conflict is the normalization of conflict. And it appears that that's where we are at, hearing a lot of from what Anna was saying. So how does the documentation part of what both of you are doing help in moving forward from this stage? And I'm going to ask you just, Mariana first and second, just to take 1 minute, short answers. There are going to be a lot of more questions, and maybe we'll do something else later on, but we are running out of time. So Mariana, the screen's yours.
Thank you. And I'll speak on documentation because from what Anna was presenting, I think it's important to clarify how this conflict has posed real serious challenges to international justice in terms of what documentation of atrocity crimes can be admitted as evidence in tribunals. So there have been protocols, the Berkeley Protocol and a protocol issued by the International Criminal Court with Eurojust for civil society organizations on measures and good practices on how to document atrocity crimes, because we are living in an era where you can take pictures on your cell phone, and where in order for that picture to be admitted as evidence, it needs to comply with certain requirements. Anna spoke about metadata, for example, and there are now many apps that are helping in these documentation processes, for example, Eyewitness for Atrocities, where you can take the picture through the application, and that already has the metadata attached to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with or edited, and that it was taken in that date at that time in that place. So these are examples of the challenges. Let's just remember historically, I think this we only have, regarding media and propaganda, we only have internationally the example of Rwanda, the media case, which was through radio broadcasting, which was different. And we also have the Holocaust under Der Stürmer magazine, which was printed media. So here we're facing, Anna's facing serious challenges because she has to document incitement through social platforms, for example, through the internet, and also through printed media. So saying that, and going to the question of what is behind Russia's motives, I really look forward to listening to Anna on this. But a recent report by the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights spoke precisely on what Anna's doing on incitement to genocide. And it argues that there is a direct and public incitement to genocide through the denial by the Russians of a distinct Ukrainian identity, through the dehumanization, and through repeatedly invoking denazification as one of the goals of the invasion, among others. And so I think this is something that is very important. It will be difficult to prove the intent. So Anna, I'll leave it at that so you can complement.
Anna, please.
Yeah, Mariana has given such a comprehensive answer that I even do not know what to add. So the first question about the Russian motives, to be very sincere, I do not know. I mean, like, I used to work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so I don't know, like, probably I have some knowledge in like politics or geopolitics, but I don't know. This is a mystery for me because I cannot understand the pattern of their attacks. They are, sorry for saying that, sometimes they are just quite silly. So they are more annoying than destructive. We cannot understand their strategic goals because they are saying that they are, just one of the examples, they are saying that they are bombing the decision-making centers. Last time they, on the 10th of October, I think it was, or on the 10th of November, they were bombing our parliament that has been a parliament 100 years ago, and now it's a museum. Or they were bombing the playground. I mean, like, there were some funny issues when they had the very old maps and they were thinking that there are some objects there, but there were no objects. Or, you know, they were coming like to places where they thought that there were forests there, but there is the illegal cut of the forest. So basically there were fields, and lots of Russians were killed in those fields. But again, the patterns are very weird and their movings are quite chaotic. So now, okay, now they are started to bomb the infrastructure. So it seems like they are going to keep it. But what they try to achieve, to be sincere, we cannot understand that. I mean, like, I do not go to those conspiracy theories, but again, like how here, like what they try to achieve, like from NATO, from Europe, I cannot understand. If they need LPR, DPR, no one knows because they already could have them. About Crimea, maybe now like the main negotiations and the main cornerstone would be the Crimea, because now everyone is pushing Zelensky to the dialogue. And this is quite, you know, this is a very like thin ice talking about the negotiations now, because in Ukraine, let's say the mood is like we do not want any negotiations. We want to win, and we want our territory like from 1991. And when we are talking again about the discourse that is inside of the country, I mean, one needs to understand then we're in the war situation. We do not have all the information opened. So when you are sitting in Ukraine, it seems like we almost won. Like the conflict will end in 2 weeks, and that Russia will be split in small parts, and Putin will die. But this goes already for 10 months. So, and this is like, okay, almost we won. So basically, for me, it's impossible to say like what Russia wants and where does it go. But again, I can say that they are putting so much like money in the missiles, but so many missiles are just striking the object that I cannot understand what is the strategic goal. What's about talking about the documentation? So basically, it was a very big surprise for me at the very start that the two biggest problems, let's say, with the documentation. First is the cooperation. Again, here we are coming like to the presence of different actors, the governmental sector, prosecutors, NGOs, civilians, etc., internationals. And at some point, it became very chaotic because the cooperation, proper cooperation, this is kind of unachievable ideal. So at least, not to make obstacles for each other. For example, when there was Bucha, people were coming there, to the zoo, literally chasing the victims and interviewing them for hundreds of times. So without the cooperation, without kind of the proper register of the victims and of the witnesses. So basically, it's very difficult to coordinate everything, at least not to cooperate, but to coordinate. Or when the internationals are coming to Ukraine, because now so much money are put in Ukraine, but they cannot understand like how to estimate situation on the ground. Again, like talking about sexual and gender-based violence, of course, there are other types of crimes, but they are not the first crimes that like are needed to be investigated like on the very first place, because of their, it always comes like to some kind of quantity of the situations. And second thing is the understanding of the overall workflow of the documentation process, because again, I told that we do not have like that very high level experts and professionals still in Ukraine. And when we're talking about the workflow, I'm talking about archiving, storaging, the stage of case building, using proper software, forming the team of documenters, and etc. So people do not think about that. They're thinking, okay, let's go and document the war crimes. But when we're talking about one of 100 moments, preserving the metadata. So we pushed and started to work with Mnemonic, the organization who helps us to store everything and to preserve the metadata. But before that, we just had a folder on a Google disk with the screenshots. And when we were communicating with the UN Commission of Inquiry, basically I was the person who was making the report for them on the war crimes. And when I was looking at our, let's say, all the NGOs folder with the war crimes, it was almost empty. It was almost empty because it was not stored in a proper manner. So there are definitely lots of issues with documentation, but the two biggest issues is basically cooperation and understanding of the overall process of the workflow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you. I think this is fascinating, the work that you're doing, the difficult work that you're doing with many of your colleagues. And we have to wrap up, but I thank you very much, Anna, Mariana, which of course I have to remember everybody, Mariana is also part of this unit of study on peace and security and humanitarian issues and law. So thank you very much for your time, for your expertise, but most importantly, thank you very much for the job that you're doing. The work, that's hard work, it's difficult work, but it's necessary to move forward, because this might be a protracted conflict. But if we don't keep the international community on its heels regarding the international law that has been agreed, then it's going to be a very difficult era for the world as we move forward. So thank you again very much. I'm gonna, and Anna, please keep safe and hope your whole family and friends are doing well and they're safe. And I'm gonna switch very quickly to Spanish just to give a few closing remarks. And thank you again very much for the presence and for all the attendees. Y muchísimas gracias a todos por habernos acompañado. Creo que queda mucho que aprender de este conflicto y seguiremos trabajando en coordinación con la unidad específica sobre el conflicto que coordina RINA. Y bueno, quiero agradecer a COMEXI, a Patricia, a todo el equipo, a Samantha, a María, a Carla, por ayudarnos a tener este evento. Y como para el próximo año tenemos ya algunos eventos que se están empezando a preparar, habrá una serie de reuniones, ojalá nos puedan acompañar, sobre la reconfiguración de la geopolítica global y el papel de México. Un poquito viendo hacia el futuro, perspectiva, veamos qué es lo que está pasando, el reacomodo global y qué juego o qué papel, qué rol puede jugar México en este sistema. Y también estamos preparando un evento en conjunto con el Stimson Center sobre paz y seguridad y tráfico de armas, que será sumamente importante, sumamente interesante. Habrá otras cosas, habrá otros temas para aquellos que no son miembros aún del grupo y se quieran incorporar al trabajo. Por favor, bienvenidos. Y si alguien tiene algún interés específico sobre algún tema a tratar, ojalá nos lo haga saber y trabajemos juntos en llevarlo a cabo. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you for your participation. And hope you all have a good day and good night. In your case.